The rain was a fine, misty veil over the streets of Shanghai, but it didn't dampen the blinding spectacle of the Vogue Gala. The red carpet, a gleaming, wet track, was a river of haute couture and diamond-encrusted celebrities. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, damp asphalt, and a low, electric hum of anticipation. Xiao Zhan stood at the beginning of the carpet, the last to walk. He was a vision in a custom suit of midnight blue, sleek and understated, a stark contrast to the glittering chaos around him. His face was a mask of serene professionalism, but underneath, his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He was here alone, as was expected. His team had briefed him endlessly. Walk, pose, smile, speak, but do not linger, and most importantly, do not interact. Not with anyone, and especially not with him. The media was a predatory beast, always looking for a weakness, a slip, a shared glance to turn into a headline. The Vogue Gala was a new level of scrutiny, an international stage where every move was amplified. The memory of the award ceremony was still fresh in everyone's minds, the aftershocks of Yibo's public defense still rippling through the industry. Everyone was watching, waiting for the smallest sign of a repeat. Just ahead of him, in the line of waiting cars, Yibo's black sedan pulled up. The roar of the fans intensified, a high-pitched shriek of adoration. Yibo stepped out, a stark silhouette against the camera flashes, his presence a raw, magnetic force. He was in a black leather outfit, a dangerous and cool counterpoint to Xiao Zhan's quiet elegance. Their teams had ensured they were placed as far apart as possible on the schedule to prevent any contact. As the car door shut, Yibo's eyes, even from a distance, seemed to find Xiao Zhan's. It was a brief, powerful moment of acknowledgement, a silent promise. And then, he was gone, a blur of motion as he was ushered to the very end of the carpet, far from where Xiao Zhan was meant to start his walk. Xiao Zhan began his slow, deliberate journey. The cameras flashed in a relentless assault, the reporters shouted questions in a dozen different languages. He moved with a practiced grace, a public figure giving the public exactly what they wanted, a perfect, unapproachable star. But as he reached the halfway point, a wave of noise from the back of the carpet made him pause. He glanced over his shoulder. The crowd's roar had transformed from a chant to a gasp of collective shock. Yibo, who should have been at the very end of the line, was walking towards the starting point. He was a black arrow cutting through the glittering throng, his face a perfect mask of cool indifference. His manager was a frantic, protesting shadow behind him, gesturing wildly, trying to pull him back, but Yibo just shrugged him off, his eyes fixed on one thing, Xiao Zhan. The reporters who were trying to interview Xiao Zhan suddenly went silent, their microphones pointed not at him, but at the approaching figure. The camera lenses, previously focused on him, swiveled in a synchronized, disbelieving motion. The red carpet, which had felt so wide and immense just a moment ago, suddenly felt like a narrow, public corridor. Xiao Zhan's own team, horrified, started to move in, a human shield ready to protect him from the impending chaos. But Xiao Zhan just stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching the impossible happen. Yibo kept walking, his step steady, his gaze unwavering. He was a force of nature, a living, breathing defiance of every rule they had ever been given. When Yibo reached him, he didn't say a word. He didn't touch him. He simply fell into step beside him. He matched his pace, his posture, his very rhythm. The cameras, which had gone still for a second, now exploded in a deafening, brilliant storm. It was a visual moment so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it transcended mere celebrity gossip. It was a statement, a bold, public declaration. The two of them walked side by side. They were a study in contrasts, one in midnight blue, the other in black leather, but together they formed a powerful, undeniable whole. Their eyes were forward, their faces unreadable, a shared, silent understanding passing between them. They walked as if they had done this 1,000 times, as if they were always meant to walk this path together. The chaos of the red carpet, which had been so overwhelming just moments ago, felt distant, almost muted. The reporters, their voices lost in the roar of a now ecstatic crowd, were speechless. They had come for a story about fashion, about fame, about who wore what. And instead, they were given something far more compelling, a story about loyalty, about courage, and about the quiet, unshakable bond between two people in the face of 1,000,000 cameras. When they reached the end of the carpet, the last photographers snapping away, their managers were waiting, faces a mix of pure fury and professional resignation. Yibo's manager, defeated, just shook his head. He knew what Yibo had done. He had created a moment so powerful, so viral, so universally loved that no agency, no brand, and no public relations team could possibly undo it. As they were ushered inside, away from the cameras and the noise, Xiao Zhan finally turned to Yibo. "You're crazy," he said, a quiet laugh escaping his lips. Yibo just shrugged, a small, triumphant smirk on his face. "I know. You didn't even say a word," Xiao Zhan said, the warmth in his voice a stark contrast to the coldness of the evening. "Didn't have to," Yibo replied, his voice a low rumble. "Some things don't need words." The night was just beginning. There would be more photos, more interviews, and a million more questions. But for the first time in a very long time, Xiao Zhan didn't feel the weight of it all alone. He had someone beside him. Someone who didn't need to say a word to make his presence known. Someone who, in a single bold and incredibly beautiful act, had redefined their story for the world to see. The air inside the gala hall was heavy with a different kind of electricity. The moment they stepped off the red carpet, 100 eyes followed them, a silent, all-encompassing gaze that was far more intimidating than the public's roar. Yibo and Xiao Zhan were a supernova of attention, and everyone knew it. Their respective teams had a quiet, tense standoff near the entrance, a mix of pure, unadulterated shock and hurried, frantic whispered conversations. Their assigned table was in a prime location, a circular fortress of white linen and gleaming cutlery. They were seated with other A-list celebrities, but the space around their chairs felt like a bubble, a palpable boundary of awe and curiosity. People smiled politely, nodded in their direction, but no one dared approach them directly at first. It was as if they had both suddenly become too hot to handle. After a few minutes, a veteran director, a man with a reputation for both genius and an intimidating temper, approached their table. He was a kingmaker in the industry, and his approval could launch or end a career. His gaze was fixed on them, a slow, appraising look. "That was a bold move," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Yibo first, a glint of respect in his eyes. "Very old school. Reminds me of the kind of raw courage we used to see in this industry." Then he turned to Xiao Zhan, a wry smile on his face. "You're a brave man, staying so calm. You know this is going to be the only thing people talk about for weeks, right? You've made yourselves a symbol." Xiao Zhan just returned the smile, his gaze steady. "I just walked the red carpet." The courage was all his. The director laughed, a surprising, full-throated sound. "Don't be so humble, boy. It takes two to break the rules that beautifully." He gave a short, firm nod and walked away, leaving a sense of approval that settled the nerves of the people at their table. But the night wasn't over. Later, as the award ceremony was in full swing, the host, still reeling from the events on the red carpet, decided to take a chance. He brought up Yibo's public defense and their joint walk, a cheeky, nervous smile on his face. "Some people call it defiance," he said, gesturing to their table. "Others call it friendship. A few of us are calling it the greatest marketing stunt of the year." The crowd chuckled politely, but their eyes were on the two men at the table, watching their every reaction. The cameras, however, were not on them. The host had a plan, a scripted joke that was supposed to put a neat, tidy bow on the whole dramatic moment. But as he began to speak, Yibo, who was already on stage to present an award with a co-star, made a bold, spontaneous move. He walked away from his co-presenter and toward the microphone alone. The host's smile froze. This was not in the script. The silence that fell was more profound than on the red carpet. A mind-blowing, heart-stopping, agonizing silence. Everyone in the room knew what was happening. Yibo, the king of cool, the man of few words, was about to speak again. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles white. His gaze, surprisingly, wasn't on the audience. It was on the floor, as if he was finding the words he needed from the very ground beneath his feet. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It's not a marketing stunt," he said, his voice low but clear. "And it's more than just friendship." The words hit like a physical shockwave. A million hearts in the room skipped a beat. This was beyond anything anyone had ever expected. The host, sensing the immense gravity of the moment, just stayed silent, his own eyes wide with shock. Yibo lifted his head, his gaze finally sweeping over the audience, past the cameras and the flashing lights, and landing on Xiao Zhan at their table. A small, sad, and infinitely tender smile touched his lips. "There are moments in life," he began, his voice taking on a raw, vulnerable quality, "when you're lost. When you feel like you're drowning, and you think no one can see you. You think you have to be strong, to carry the weight alone, to prove something to everyone else." He paused, a single beat of silence. "And then, there's a moment when you realize that someone has been with you all along. That they've been in that same dark place. That they see you. Not just the public you, but the real you. The human you. And they reach out their hand to you, not to pull you out, but just to remind you that you're not alone in the water." The entire room was silent. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken emotion. This was not a speech. It was a confession. "That's what he did for me," Yibo continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "He taught me that it's okay to be vulnerable. That there's more strength in admitting your fear than in pretending you don't have any. He gave me courage when I had none. So when I had the chance to give him a little back, on stage, and on a red carpet, I didn't even have to think about it. It wasn't a choice." His gaze returned to Xiao Zhan. It was a truth. Xiao Zhan's eyes were filled with tears, a single drop escaping and trailing a path down his cheek. He made no effort to wipe it away. He just sat there, a portrait of profound emotion. The whole room felt it. It was a public acknowledgment of a bond so deep, so personal, that it left them breathless. It was not a grand, romantic gesture. It was something deeper, something rooted in shared pain and mutual redemption. After a long moment, Yibo finally placed the microphone back on the stand. He didn't wait for the applause, which was now starting as a slow, building crescendo of respect and admiration. He just walked off the stage, his head held high, his mission accomplished. The night ended in a daze. The ride home was silent, but it was a comfortable, knowing quiet. They had given the world a story, a mind-blowing, captivating, and deeply personal truth. And now, the cameras could capture what they wanted. It didn't matter. They were a team. The global reaction was not a ripple, it was a tidal wave. By the time their cars pulled away from the gala venue, the internet was already in a state of controlled chaos. The clips of Yibo's impromptu speech were everywhere, subtitled in a dozen languages. It wasn't just Chinese media. International entertainment news outlets were covering it, dissecting every word, every gesture, every nuance. The headlines were a mix of stunned disbelief and effusive praise. One major entertainment news site ran a banner across its homepage that simply read, "The most courageous confession in a generation." Critics, who had been ready to pounce on the red carpet incident as a calculated publicity stunt, were left speechless by the raw vulnerability of Yibo's words. His speech was so genuine, so profoundly personal, that it defied all cynical interpretations. The online world became a forum of shared emotion. Fans of both artists, who had long operated in separate, often competitive spaces, united in a powerful, unified front. The hashtag #CourageousConfession trended for days. People shared their own stories of finding support in their darkest moments, crediting Yibo's words for giving them a voice. It became a cultural moment, a testament to the power of a single act of honesty. Back in the agencies, the scene was very different. The initial panic had been replaced by a grudging respect. Yibo's manager, who had been ready to read him the riot act, found himself fielding calls from major brands who were suddenly interested in signing him. The defiance had transformed into a brand identity of integrity and loyalty. "We can't control it," his manager admitted to a colleague, "so we have to lean into it. He's not just a star now, he's a symbol." The same was true for Xiao Zhan's team. The storm of criticism that had followed him for years, the subtle digs and veiled insults, had been almost entirely erased. Yibo's words had reframed the entire narrative. The public wasn't just looking at Xiao Zhan as an actor anymore. They were seeing him as a survivor, and more importantly, as a friend. A few days later, a private meeting was called. It was a rare, unprecedented gathering of their two agencies. The tension in the room was thick. The managers, normally rivals, sat across from each other, their faces weary but their eyes glinting with a new kind of respect. The two men who had caused all this chaos sat quietly, listening. Yibo spoke first, his voice low and firm. "We did what we had to do. We didn't do it for headlines or for money. We did it for us. Xiao Zhan nodded in agreement. We have to be honest with ourselves and with everyone. We are friends. We support each other. If that's a problem, then we need to talk about it now. The managers exchanged a long, meaningful look. They knew the public had chosen. The fans had made their decision. Any attempt to separate them now would be seen as a betrayal, a sign of weakness and cowardice in an industry that was suddenly craving authenticity. The defiance of their clients had become their greatest asset. It's not a problem, Yibo's manager finally said, a reluctant smile on his face. It's a new reality. The industry is changing, and you too. You've changed it. We just have to figure out how to manage it. Xiao Zhan and Yibo looked at each other, a shared, silent sigh of relief passing between them. They had gambled, they had risked everything, and they had won. The rules of the game had been broken, and now they had the chance to write their own.